yeshiva world tend to favor the hashkafa of the Ramchal?
I got a letter about a month ago from somebody who says, I don't know why you're so interested in Ramchal. Nobody's heard of him. Nobody cares about him. Nobody's, why do you think he has so much authority? First of all, I don't think it's the yeshiva world. For example, the Mesilas Yesharim is learned in every yeshiva in the world. Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Hasidic, Yeshivish, whatever you like. It has become a universal sefer. The Gaon of Vilna said, the works of Jewish mysticism go back to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Let me just make a point which many people are misled about. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did not write the Zohar. That's just not correct. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had a yeshiva, and in that yeshiva had many, many discussions with many, many participants, and he assigned one of his Talmidim, Rabbi Abba, to edit and organize those discussions. The Zohar is an account of the discussions in Rabbi Shimon's yeshiva and all the people who traveled and had various experiences. Shimon was the leader, but he certainly didn't author the text. Rabbi Abba was the one who organized it and attached it to the sequence of the Chumash, very much like what Rabbi Rav Ashi did to the discussions of the Mishnah, which they divided into Masechtos, attached to the various Mishnahs and the various Masechtos. Okay. So, Gaon of Vilna said, the origin of Jewish mystical texts is, if I'm not counting Yechezkel, is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. After that comes the Arizal. After that comes Chaim Vital, who wrote down all the Arizal's works. After that came the Ramchal. And after that comes B, said the Gra. That's the line of Jewish mysticism. The Gaon of Vilna was a great expert in Jewish mysticism. He wrote commentaries on mystical tracts. He was a great expert in Jewish mysticism, among everything else. And he said, were the Ramchal alive today in Italy, I would walk to Italy to learn from him. And when one of the Ramchal's Sfarim was delivered to him, he put on his Shabbos clothes to celebrate the fact that he had received that sefer. Now, you have probably picked up that the Gaon of Vilna has immense authority. If he put the Ramchal on that kind of a pedestal, that's going to have an enormous impact on Ashkenazi Jewry. I can't explain, the way things developed in the Sephardi world. I'm just ignorant. I don't know about it. But I can tell you that that Sefer of the Ramchal is read everywhere in the world. When I asked my Rebbe Zatzal, should I learn Musar? He said, it's not unreasonable. And if you go to learn Musar, learn the Mesilas Yesharim. Why? Because it's based on Kabbalah. After all, how many chapters are there in the Mesilas Yesharim? Specialist question. 26. 26, which is the numerical value of God's name, the Gematria. And how many midos, how many different characteristics are discussed? 10, because 10 is the ladder of the midos that the world is created. And Ramchal was a great Kabbalist. Now, that's the educational and scholarly situation. If you'll ask me personally, and I've discussed it with some people who know the Ramchal very well, I think the Ramchal's basic character is that he's a philosopher. Now, of course, you'll poo-poo this and say, sure, Gottlieb, you're a philosopher, so you want to read yourself into him. I'm aware of that, and I'm aware that happens. I'm even aware that sometimes I do it. But in this case, I think it's right. First of all, the Ramchal was a great organizer, systematizer, and he cared about defining concepts, and he cared about organizing them, analyzing them. By the way, there are dozens of places where the Ramchal follows the Rambam, Maimonides, who, at least in his explicit writings, was not a Makubal. Was not a Kabbalist. And you cannot find, I can't find almost any references to the Ramban, Nachmanides, who was the greatest Kabbalist of the medieval period, no mention whatsoever. He even copies whole passages from the Rambam, and he copies the Rambam's terminology. But as I say, more than that, you have conceptual analysis. Maybe you heard of the four worlds, the four Kabbalistic worlds? Well, Ramchal says, strictly speaking, there are only three, strictly speaking. And you have a mountain of Kabbalistic writings about the four worlds. And Ramchal says, yeah, I know. but there are only three. Why? Because he says, what is a world? What is a world? When's the last time somebody asked that question? What is a world? A world is a group of things that interact with one another. Now, in the four worlds, if you start with world 2, there are creatures in that world, the souls, at least Jewish souls. And world 3, the creatures are angels. And world 4, the creatures are the physical world. But in world 1, there are no creatures at all. There's only God in world 1. You'll tell me, but the Kabbalah talks about spheros and partzufim and all sorts of elements in those godly worlds. Says Ramchal, that's true. It does talk about that, but that's all only the way it's presented to us. Really, it's a unity. And since really unity, you don't have a group of interacting entities. If you don't have a group of interacting entities, it's not a world. See, that's very tough-minded, it's very independent, and very philosophical. Take the concept seriously, try to give it a definition, see how it applies. You have heard, because it's written in the Siddur, that God continually remakes the creation, or makes the creation anew, however we should define it, right? You learn about that. Chal asks, why does he do that? Why does he do that? Says Ramchal, he could have made it in such a way that it carried itself. Nothing's too hard for God. As long as the way you describe it is consistent, and it clearly is consistent, he could have made it and let it carry on by itself. Why did he do that? I don't know anybody else who asks the question. And you know what he answers? He answers, the fact that God continuously makes the world means that his will is giving existence to each thing in the world, and that means he's acting in the world, and that means he's available to us. The goal of our lives is to connect to him. We can only connect to him if he's available. By creating the world continuously, he makes himself available. So he gives what we would call ruchniistic, a spiritual answer to this question. But he asks the question. You find that throughout the Ramchal. Ramchal is concerned with defining concepts, he's concerned with organizing principles. He talks in one place about a tremendous economy. God has to hide in order for there to be free will. Okay, now what are you going to do with your free will? I don't know, jump through hoops, weave baskets. God could set up any project that he wants, and he could judge us on how well we carry out the project. But that isn't what God did. God hides in order for us to be able to have free will, and then the task is to reveal him from his position of being hidden. And the Ramchal says, and therefore you see, there's only one fundamental principle, not two. That matters, because it's more economical, it's more efficient. That's a philosophical grasp. So really, the Ramchal is a philosopher. He knew all of the Kabbalah, he knew all of the open areas of Torah, and he wrote dialogues, and he even wrote plays. I don't think we have all of the things that he wrote. He died before the age of 40. He makes a remark in the Derech Hashem. Rabbi Kaplan put out an edition of Derech Hashem, and he has sources. He makes a remark in Derech Hashem, which on the surface looks like an open contradiction. Bothered me for years. I learned the Daf Yomi. One year I was learning Yuma. In the end of Yuma, I don't learn all the Taisus, and I wish I did. I happened to read through a Taisus. Taisus says it word for word. Word for word. What the Ramchal says. And it's not a contradiction because Taisus explains it. Derech Hashem, he doesn't explain much. He just lays down the facts. I don't think Rabbi Kaplan caught that one. But I thought, okay, so Ramchal knew that Taisus, and he was using it like he knew everything else. Anyway, we're talking about someone whose scope and whose depth was among the very greatest in the last 300 years. And he wrote Sfarim in I think in almost every style that anyone could be interested in. Mesilas Yesharim is Musar. There's a lot to be said about that, and I'll spare you. There's Musar, and the Das Tunis is more directly philosophical. And he has a number of introductory and specialized Kabbalistic works. And he has a work on the nature of Talmudic logic. I mean, he has a work on definitions, an early work, what it means to define something. I mean, he's really one of the unmatched people. That's a little bit. Yeah, what else is, yeah.
I learned recently that basically experiencing physical pleasure does not diminish your pleasure in the world to come, which is understandable. But experiencing certain spiritual pleasures in this world can, such as receiving honor from a lot of people at one time. I heard that from Rabbi Radowitz. And my question would be, well, it's a twofold question. First of all, what other spiritual pleasures could you experience here that could do that could take away from your Olam Haba? And where does the pleasure of music stand in this respect?
You're speaking to a musician, so that's a question that's very meaningful to me. First of all, let's understand the criterion. You said it well. I mean, you're quoting Rabbi Radowitz, so of course it's being said well. Physical pleasure per se doesn't have to take to reduce your reward in the world to come. Doesn't have to. It might or might not. How do you know which is which? The answer is this. I mean, there are two sources of Chazal. There's a Yerushalmi, which says that when I get to the world to come, I will have to give an accounting for every pleasure that was available to me, and I didn't take it. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he was on his deathbed, said, I declare that I have not had as much pleasure of the world as my little finger. So who's right? Are you supposed to have pleasure? Not supposed to have pleasure. The answer is very simple. I have a number of sources on pleasure. I can go through them if you like. Positive sources on pleasure. There is a spiritual purpose of pleasure. One spiritual purpose of pleasure is gratitude. If you experience a pleasure and you acknowledge where it's coming from, and you feel and express gratitude to God for that pleasure, then that pleasure is connecting you to God. That's an opportunity to connect. On that, Yerushalmi says, if you had an opportunity for a pleasure which would result in connecting to God, and you passed it up, and because you passed it up, you've sacrificed that connection to God, you're going to have to give an accounting for that. God put that pleasure in the world, made you capable of it, and created circumstances which at least some of the time will lead to connecting to God. You have no right to pass that up. On the other hand, pleasures can also drive a person inside himself just to experience the pleasure and cut everything out externally out. Right? That means that that pleasure will cut a person off from God. That kind of pleasure is spiritual poison. That's the criterion by which you determine whether a pleasure is going to contribute to spirituality. I'll tell you something dramatic. There's a Mishnah that says, Schar mitzvah mitzvah. 3 words. Roughly, the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah. Those 3 words are ambiguous. Hard to believe. How could 3 words be ambiguous? I mean syntactically ambiguous. Not that the word mitzvah could mean 2 things. But the syntax and the structure is ambiguous. And if you look in the Bartanura's translation, Bartanura's commentary, which I recommend, you'll see 2 comments based on the ambiguity in the words. The first comment, everybody knows. And the second commentary, nobody knows. Because if I don't tell people where it comes from, they say, you made it up. Nobody knows it. Let's try the first one. The first one says, the reward for a mitzvah is a mitzvah. That is to say, when you do a mitzvah, as a reward, you'll have the opportunity to do another mitzvah. The syntax now becomes this. The reward of a mitzvah, you don't know what that is. You don't know what it is. You may have a number of ideas in your mind. I have news for you. I'm going to reveal something to you. You know what the reward of a mitzvah is? Trying for trumpets. The reward of a mitzvah is the opportunity to do another mitzvah. That's a new idea, and now you've learned something. That's one way to take it. But the other way to take it is this. Reward of a mitzvah, you know what that is. You get pleasure from doing the mitzvah. You get a certain benefit from doing the mitzvah. Maybe your reputation increases, or you earn money, whatever it is. You get certain benefits of doing the mitzvah. Everybody knows what the benefit, what the reward is. But now I'm going to tell you a tremendously new idea. All that benefit you get from doing the mitzvah is also mitzvah. It's more mitzvah. It's added mitzvah. The mitzvah becomes bigger because you had the benefit in doing the mitzvah. That's what the Bartanura says. Now I must tell you, I don't understand the Bartanura as it's written straight. I can't deal with it. I can't deal with the concept. But I can fill in a little background to make the words reasonable if I limit them in a certain way. And this just means that I'm not getting part of it. Ask yourself, if you do what's right, let's say in responsibility to another person, you do what's right out of duty, I owe this, it's obligatory, so I do it, or I do it out of love. Two questions. Which performance will I enjoy more?
The love.
Sure, I do it out of love. I'm thrilled to do it. I want to do it. Opportunity to show my love for my beloved. I'm going to get a lot more pleasure out of doing it out of love than doing it merely out of duty. Good. Now, which is the higher performance? The more valuable performance, the spiritually superior performance. In our tradition, it's doing it out of love. Doing it out of mere dutifulness, obedience is the lower performance. The highest service of God is service out of love of God. Which means the fact that you have pleasure from it doesn't detract from it at all if it's this kind of pleasure. If it's the pleasure of doing something out of love, then the Bartanura's remark, I think, can be understood straightforwardly. It's the pleasure of doing it out of love, that pleasure adds to the quality of the mitzvah. Okay? So here's a good example of how a pleasure can add to, reinforce your connection with God instead of taking you away from God. Now, let's apply this criterion to your question. Your question was about spiritual pleasures. The word spiritual could be discussed in this context, whether honor is really for spiritual pleasure or not. But okay, I'm not going to worry about that. But I think the same criterion could apply to the spiritual pleasures as well. You have to ask yourself whether, in this sense of spiritual we're using, whether the particular pleasure you're talking about is likely to reinforce your connection to God, or it's likely to detract from your connection to God. Let's take gratitude. People appreciate it when others show gratitude to them. They get a pleasure out of that. That might work either way. If I'm very strongly mindful of the fact that whatever I do, I only am successful because God makes me successful, and I do something for George, and George says, wow, what you did for me helped me so much. It was so I'm going to say, Baruch Hashem, that God made me able to do that. He used me as a tool to give to you what you want, and that will reinforce my connection to God. Now, honor is very dangerous, because honor is a sense of superiority. Or the people, if A gives honor to B, what he's expressing is that B is superior to him.
So B is not mindful of God.
He might or might not be, but when it's superiority, that feeds ego, and that can lead to pride. And pride is a disaster. Pride is a disaster. God says the proud person and I cannot live in the same world. Pride, docha ragle eshchina. It pushes the feet of God's presence out of your domain. So maybe that's what he meant. Honor can lead to pride. It leads to pride, and it's a spiritual disaster. So one has to be but I think, I didn't hear him say it, and I'm not familiar with the idea, I haven't heard it from him, but I would say that's one reasonable criterion. Will the pleasure, physical or spiritual, lead to a greater connection to God, or will it lead to a disconnection from God? And if it's inherently likely to lead to a disconnection from God, then it's going to diminish your olam haba, because it's going to diminish your connection to God altogether.
And what about music then?
Oh, so what about music? Well, I don't know whether you should classify. I sort of was cautious about using the word spiritual. I don't know how you classify music as physical or spiritual. Let me tell you something that Rabbi Solomon wrote in an essay on music. He wrote, he asked, in the beginning of Megillas Esther, where it describes the banquet, the enormous banquet that Achashverosh put out, with all the luxuries that he provided, music is not there. Music is not there. Surely in the Persian banqueting, they had music. Why isn't it there? So I forget whether he quoted this for somebody or it was his own idea. He said, music arouses in a person feelings and associations which are part of his identity and his culture. Let's suppose that Achashverosh hires a band to play war music. Right? The Persians will think of defeating the Romans, right? The Jew will think of defeating his Yetzer Hara, his evil inclination. Suppose the band plays love music. So the Persian will think Persian thoughts about love, and the Jew will think about love of God. You can't undermine people with music because the music is going to arouse in them the thoughts and associations that they're used to from their own culture. You're not going to undermine their culture in that way. There are exceptions, and he talks about them, but the point is then, I would say, that music is either neutral, it's a neutral pleasure, like physical pleasures. I wouldn't call it physical, but it's like physical in that respect. You simply enjoy listening to certain music. Or, if it carries cultural overtones, then you might be in trouble. Because if you know the cultural overtones, if you know the associations, so when you hear the music, your mind is going to be filled with those associations, and that might hurt you.
If they're bad associations.
Right.
If they're healthy associations.
Yeah, then I don't know anything wrong with that. I know several Rosh Yeshiva who used to listen to classical music. One used to listen to Mozart because he said it puts him in a certain frame of mind. And this, by the way, is true for aesthetics altogether. A fellow I know, an American, was on the separate beach in Tel Aviv, and there was an older gentleman there sitting in a beach chair facing the ocean, but he didn't go into the ocean. We didn't have any grandchildren with him. And because my acquaintance is an American, he has no manners and no self-control. And he goes over to this, I happen to know who the gentleman was, he told me, and there's no name greater than his. And he said to him, what are you doing here? You're here, you're at the ocean, you're not swimming, no grandchildren, what are you here for? And the person answered, I'm a posek. I make practical decisions in Jewish law. Being a posek requires making very fine distinctions, very careful definitions, paying very careful attention to subtle details. From time to time, I come to look at the ocean to restore my mental balance, to experience the greatness, the breadth, the depth, the power of the ocean, to restore my mental balance. That's one way to use aesthetics. It's one way to use aesthetics, to restore that mental balance. Right? So if music can do that, then it's going to be definitely positive. He was using the sea to do that, but music can do that also. So I think it'll again be the same criterion, whether it increases your connection to God or decreases it. The purpose of life is to connect to God. That's the criterion for everything that we do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You're welcome. And by the way, I listen to classical music all the time, but not Wagner, because of the associations. Richard Strauss is okay because he rebelled against the Nazis. He opposed them, and he copied many of Wagner's themes and phraseology. It wasn't as great as Wagner, but you can get some of the Wagner, but you can get some of the flavor of Wagner from Richard Strauss. Yeah. Okay. What's noch? Yeah.
What's your opinion on a Baal Tshuva becoming Hasidic?
About to becoming Hasidic, first of all, sometimes it's motivated by an inappropriate attachment to external details. Wow, those woolen tzitzis on top of the shirt, man, that's really cool. Boy, am I Jewish when I put those on. Nobody can touch me. My Rebbe Zatzal, this institution, those who I think approach Kiruv in the appropriate way, say external changes should reflect prior internal changes. The real changes have to work on our internal. Your values, your priorities, the way you interact with people and with the world, your customs, your habits, your knowledge base. These are the things that really, then you can express it in an appropriate way. That's number one. Number two, Hasidus is a very complex way of implementing Judaism. It's complex, it's integrated, it takes from many strands simultaneously and weaves them together. To really appreciate it is quite difficult. I can tell you, I started with no background, zero background, and I learned Hebrew, and I learned how to daven, and I struggled for years and made my way to becoming literate in Talmud. And then it took another couple of years to become literate in Tosfos, because Tosfos is just as hard as the Talmud all over again. And after all of that, when I started to read Hasidus, it was like starting all over again. Because a Hasidic text can, on one page, quote verses from the prophets and sections of the Talmud and of the Midrash and of the philosophical works and the Kabbalistic works all on one page. and they're just quotes. And the reader, the author assumes that the reader can translate, can punctuate, knows the styles of each of the sources, and can follow the connections between them. Pri Tzaddik is what I started with. My Rabbi told me to start with Pri Tzaddik. It's breathtaking, and it's very, very challenging. Very challenging. So to get into the literature is a long way down the path. Many of the practices of Hasidus are they create an external, visible barrier, cutoff to interacting with the rest of the world. So the Baal Tshuva is going to worry about his family. He's going to fight battles with his family, which may be needless from the point of view of his just becoming a Baal Tshuva. So I think that it would be only appropriate in a special case, a case where a person needs the breadth of Hasidus, needs the philosophical depth of Hasidus. Hasidic Sforim deal with philosophical topics because that's part of what they're doing. They deal with Kabbalistic topics, that's part of what they do. Some people need that and some people don't. So I can't say that it would be appropriate for everyone, and because it's a hard journey, I would only recommend it in cases where a person simply couldn't make his peace with the more simplified styles of Jewish observance.
This should be drawn out over a long period of time.
Absolutely. All transition should be drawn out over a period of time. Rushing to change, which people do in a fit of enthusiasm, is terribly, terribly dangerous. I've seen so many disasters. I'll tell you why. I'll give you one reason why it's a disaster. Let's divide the human being roughly, crudely, into three dimensions. There's intellectual, emotional, and behavioral. Each person, these dimensions react in different ways. If you ask, where is it easier for you to change? Where is it harder for you to change? Each person is going to have a different story. If you're a trained intellectual, you can put on and take off a set of ideas like putting on and taking off your jacket. You're just used to that. Okay, do it this way. What would a communist say? Reel it out. Right? Emotional change may be terribly, terribly difficult. Behavioral change may be somewhere in between. Now, imagine such a person who's enthused, inspired, and wants to change. What's going to happen? He's going to identify with those parts of himself that change easiest and fastest and leave behind the parts that are harder to change. Okay, but that has a limit because at a certain point he's going to be out of sync with himself. He's going to know that. And that's going to be a terrible crash. The counsel is, go slowly enough that the slower parts can respond, react, and adjust and adapt. If you don't do that, you're in danger of coming apart. So that's why all change should take into account the different aspects of the person, and the change should be slow enough that the person... Sometimes, by the way, change in development in Torah living is, I think the contour is something like this. There's rise, there are sometimes falling back and dips, and then there are plateaus. And a plateau is where you have just undertaken a significant rise, and now it needs to be integrated. It needs to be integrated. You have to pull all the parts of you together and reorganize them around this new change. And during that period of time, you're not going to take on new changes. You're simply integrating the old change. That's the rhythm. And I think that rhythm has to be respected. Yeah.
Another share was that we were talking about the Rambam and the Moreh Nevuchim and how we have to sort of understand that things that he may have said in the Moreh Nevuchim differ from other things he says in the Mishnah Torah. I'm trying to find examples of where he may have said things that were very different, and I don't know, maybe...
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples, but this is a very difficult topic because the Rambam at the end of his life cross-references his books. There are subjects where he says, as I said in the commentary of the Mishnah, and I said it in the Mishnah Torah, and I said it in the Moreh Nevuchim. So he didn't see himself as doing anything revolutionary. He didn't see himself as two people, up to the Moreh Nevuchim and after the Moreh Nevuchim. That's simply not the way he viewed his work. But you do find pretty open contradictions, which have led some to say that the Moreh Nevuchim was written for a certain type of audience, and for that type of audience, he wasn't going to share the perspective that he had in the earlier works. One example is sacrifices. Now, in the Mishnah Torah, he says it is sacrifices that maintain and perfect the world. They're absolutely fundamental. They maintain and perfect the world. He cites the fact that Noach, when he came out of the ark, offered sacrifices. Right? The Rambam, although this might not be a Rabbi, but he writes it, the principle of the Mishnah Torah is to codify all the laws that will be practiced in the times of the Mashiach. And all the laws of sacrifices are there. Now in the Moreh Nevuchim, he says that sacrifices were instituted because people could not have a religion. They could not feel that they were relating to God without sacrifices. Sacrifices were so universally practiced that if you tell the person that you're going to relate to God and have a religious life without sacrifices, it would be like saying you're going to live without breathing. Or, as he says it would be like telling someone today that you're going to have a religious life and relate to God without prayer. No one would accept that. That's impossible. So for them, sacrifices played that role. So God instituted sacrifices for them because without it, they wouldn't have been able to exist in spiritual terms. Taking that Moreh Nevuchim by itself, fools have said, Maimonides clearly looks at our period of time as much superior because we get along without sacrifices. We use only prayer. So obviously we're in a superior position. I call them fools because in the Mishnah Torah, he says that at the times of Mashiach, we'll go back to sacrifices. Those times will be even better than our times today. So that can't be right. And then the question is, well, if he says that sacrifices are what make the world exist and perfect the world, how then could he say what he said in the Moreh Nevuchim? That's one example. Another example, that's well known. That's a well-known, well-discussed example. Another example, which I haven't seen discussed, but I worked on about 6 months ago. In the Moreh Nevuchim, he says, what is the purpose for which God created the world? And he says, there are people who will tell you that man is the purpose. You've probably heard that. And he says, that's certainly wrong. That's certainly wrong. Why is it wrong? Because the spheres and the stars and the angels are qualitatively superior to man, and you don't create the superior to serve the inferior. No intelligent agent does that. Doesn't create the superior to serve the inferior. So since they are superior to us, clearly they couldn't have been created to serve us. There's a lot more to the discussion, but that's his central proof that man can't be the purpose of creation. Yeah, but if you look in the Mishnah Torah and the commentary on the Mishnah, you'll see, he says several times, he put the pieces together, that the soul of a human being is greater than that of an angel. Which means the spheres and the constellations, the stars and the angels are inferior to us. Not superior, but inferior. Which means the argument that he gave just isn't correct. But he's ignoring that. In the Moreh Nevuchim, he speaks of human being as a body. He says, these are not they don't have bodies, and they don't change, they don't die, and so therefore they're obviously superior. What happened to the soul? Just leaves that out. It's another indication to me that he's dealing with a person for whom the appeal to the soul is not going to work. He's not going to hear it. So Rambam simply left out that part of his, and what he's trying to do is show how far you can get with these self-imposed limitations. He's writing for a person who is trained in Greek philosophy through the Arabic translations and tradition, and who wants to be a faithful Jew, and has some knowledge of Judaism, but his knowledge is, certain ways, kind of rudimentary, because the first 50 chapters of the Moreh Nevuchim are devoted to showing that God doesn't have a body. 50 chapters. For this fellow, that wasn't obvious. And he spends 50 chapters going through the vast majority of expressions in the Tanakh which would indicate being embodied and showing how to understand them so that they don't have that implication. So I think the Mishnah Torah is a programmatic work. And then, I don't know if somebody said this to me or I thought of it myself. I can't remember things like that anymore. But the little peculiarity that I would just mention, maybe we'll mention it to other people and get a reaction to it. The commentary of the Mishnah he wrote for Jews who were basically illiterate. He wrote it in Arabic, and his systematic introductions to vast sections of Jewish law, as if the person had never heard of them. And although he includes some quite sophisticated philosophical material there, but it's written for the person whose knowledge of Jewish text is minimal. The Mishnah Torah himself, he says, he wrote for a person who can't arrive at the law by studying the Talmud. You can't do that. Listen, if you can't do it, I'll give you the law laid straight out. The Moreh Nevuchim is written subject to the limitations that I just described to you. Where did the Rambam write a book about what he really believes? Maybe he didn't do that. Each of his books is written to an audience of people who are incompetent in one way or another. So I wonder, did he ever, really say what he believes? Or did he hide it? Did he hint at it? Now, he does say in the introduction to the Moreh Nevuchim that he hinted at things, he didn't write them out explicitly, and so on and so on. But I think you have to take into account the intended audience when you read a book. And since each case, the intended audience was someone who was distinctly inferior to him, he wasn't writing to an equal. So I wonder whether we really have an accurate picture, at least on the surface, of what the Rambam really believed. Yeah.
People also sometimes say that the Rambam was anti all mystical ideas, and is there anything in his writings that would suggest evidence that he had knowledge of Kabbalistic teachings? Or
okay, see, now you see what you've done now. You spoke two sentences, presumably asking the same question, but they are utterly different from one another.
Okay.
Let's suppose there isn't a single hint anywhere in his writings of any Kabbalistic ideas. That wouldn't indicate opposition. That would just indicate silence. That wouldn't indicate opposition. I give you one piece of indirect evidence. Rav Saadia Gaon, who lived a century or more before the Rambam, writes in his Sefer Emunus V'Deus that reincarnation is not true. He apparently had heard about it from some source or other, and he said, it's not true. We who have the mystical tradition know that it is true, but he didn't have that. Okay, Maimonides is silent about this. Doesn't mention it anywhere. I find that very curious. The Rambam was not shy. And he wrote quite comprehensively. He has a summary of Arabic philosophy, which is comprehensive, and he analyzes their methods and shows what's right and wrong about them, mostly wrong. Why doesn't he mention it at all? So, does that mean that he doesn't want to oppose it for whatever reason? Now, the Rambam writes in the beginning of the third part of the Moreh Nevuchim, he has an account of the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, the chariots and the wheels and the different types of angels and the fires in the eyes and all sorts of stuff. Rambam says, I think I've discovered the meaning of this passage. And that is the heart of the deepest Jewish thinking, Ma'aseh Merkava. On the other hand, he said, I had no teacher. This material was forgotten from the Jewish people because of the persecutions. I had no teacher. I handled this out on my own. So maybe I'm not right. It's a Rambam writing. Maybe I'm not right. You want to feel the Rambam as a person. And this Sefer comes across as a person. It's exquisite. But on the other hand, he says, if I don't communicate it, then I will be guilty of hiding it from future generations. On the third hand, if this really is Ma'aseh Merkava, you're not allowed to teach it. Not allowed to teach it directly. Only allowed to give chapter headings, and those who understand on their own can pick it up. So he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write for you an account of the first few chapters of Ezekiel. And you may read through it and think, he didn't do anything. That's what it says in the book. And he's just summarizing, paraphrasing what it says in the book. That's the way it may seem to you. But I'm telling you, I hid in there the message I want to communicate. That's what he says. Great. I read that passage, I don't know, 10 times? To me, it sounds like he's just giving a running summary and paraphrase of the first few chapters of Ezekiel. I don't get it at all. I don't get it at all. It's hidden too deep for me to uncover. So, what is that thing that's the Ma'aser Merkava according to him? There are those who say one way and those who say the other. Well, I'll tell you, Rabbi Meiselman, in his book, Torah, Chazal, and Science, which is a classic, he quotes a very interesting Ran. There's something called Ma'aser Bereishis, the work of creation. Those two are associated in the Gemara as very esoteric materials that should not be taught directly in public, and Ma'aser Merkava has certain restrictions, and Ma'aser Bereishis has restrictions, just a little bit less. And the Rambam in the introduction to the Moreh Nevuchim says that they're related because through the Ma'aser Bereishis you get foundations and for the Ma'aser Merkava, which is Jewish mysticism. And if you reflect back, you see in the Ma'aser Bereishis instances of Jewish mysticism, so they all belong in the same thing. Fine. And therefore, the Mishnah in Chagiga says you don't teach it directly, you teach it only to two students, one at a time, and I'd be two students, and only with the chapter headings and all the rest. Now, when you look at his summary of the material in the first few chapters of Yesodei Torah, the fundamentals of the Torah, Ma'aser Bereishis sounds like Greek natural philosophy. There are four elements, and they mix to combine to form creatures, and they're the spheres, and they're the stars in the spheres, and they go around, and so on and so on. It looks like Greek natural philosophy. The question that people raise is, how could Maimonides understand the Mishnah in Chagiga, which says you don't teach it? How could he think of it as a secret doctrine if everyone who studies Greek philosophy knows it? It's taught in schools. There are commentaries. It's common knowledge. How could he think of that as? So the Ran, in the Dreshus Ran, explains this as follows. There are two ways to approach the natural world: bottom up and top down. Bottom up means I observe the world. I do experiments. I manipulate the world in various ways. I notice correlations of events in the natural world. And then I try to analyze them, and I try to create theories that will explain them. And in that way, I come to a certain understanding of the natural world. That's bottom up, starting with what you observe of the world, noticing correlations, and then creating theories to explain it. There's another way. The world, after all, is created. And the Creator set up certain foundations, and those foundations then expressed themselves in the natural world. Those foundations were revealed to the prophets. Now you look at a lion, or a chair, or a star. There are two ways you can analyze it. You can analyze it bottom up, through observation and theorizing, or you can analyze it top down, taking the principles that were revealed to the prophets and using them to understand this thing as a creature, as created by God. That is what is Ma'aser Bereishis and Ma'aser Merkava. It's not Ma'aser Bereishis, let's say, the studying of the natural world. It's not studying the natural world the way the scientist studies the natural world. It's studying the natural world the way God created it as it was revealed through the prophets. So both of them are about stars and lions and chairs and tables, but their content and their origin is very, very different from one another. That would answer the questions that they ask about the Rambam, but the Ran actually says it. So that being the case, that's what would be Ma'aser Bereishis. But at any rate, I'm just showing you things that are in the Mishnah Torah that aren't in the Moreh Nevuchim, and I don't think this means he changed his mind. I think it means that in the Moreh Nevuchim, he was writing for a particular audience, and therefore he used material that was relevant to that audience. Yeah.
I was reading in Hod the King, I think it was quoting Pirkei Avot, said, all my life I've lived among Talmidei Chachamim, but I did not find anything better for the guf el shtika, rather than silence. I was wondering why it says the guf, why the body? What's silence got to do with the body?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly required. All Talmud Torah is based on speech. Not only is it done by a conversation, but the sources say that speaking out the learning is the way you should learn. You should not sit and read silently with your eyes. You should not do that. You should speak out what you're reading, and then speak out the discussion. If I say this, if I say that, so on and so on. Learning with speech is something which is at least much superior, and in a certain way, it might even be essential. Now, that means one cannot preach silence as, in general, a good characteristic. What will happen to a person's learning? But when it comes to the body and the physical world, there, the vast majority of what we talk about is compromised in various ways. It's exaggerated, it's too emphasized, it reinforces inappropriate attitudes and so on and so on. So I think maybe that's what he means. But it's certainly related specifically to the goof, to the body. Because when it comes to spiritual matters, speech is, prayer is speech. We shouldn't pray. Saying the Shema is speech. We shouldn't say the Shema. Certainly silence is not going to be applicable when talking about spiritual expression. There's probably more there. I'm sure there's more there than I remember, but that's the limitation is absolutely crucial. Without that limitation, it wouldn't make any sense at all. Okay, well, I'll tell you one little thing, and I'll quit. That's last week's Parsha. It's at the end of the Parsha, there's a very odd requirement. A person who commits a certain crime has to bring a chatas. Chatas is a sin offering. And this sin offering is variable. It depends upon your income. If you have enough money, you should bring a certain animal as a sin offering. If you don't have enough money, you should bring a pair of birds. 2 birds, not one. And one of the birds is offered as a sin offering, a bird sin offering, and the other is offered as a bird burnt offering, which has different rules, and it's not for the sake of sin or anything. And if you don't have enough money to bring a pair of birds, then you bring a korban mincha, which is out of flour and oil and so forth and so on. But the question is, you're dealing with a sin offering here. Why, if it's birds, must you have 2, and one of them isn't a sin offering at all? It's a holy burnt offering, an olah. Now, boys and girls, this is a good question. And if you want to win some points at the Shabbos table or whatever, you go around to families, ask that question. It's a good question. The Rashba, in a tshuva, in a responsum, answers the question. And in the answer, there lies a quite deep insight, I think. He says, when you bring a chatas animal, 3 things happen. Blood goes on the altar, part of it is burned up on the altar, and part of it is eaten by the priests. When you bring a bird, whichever bird you bring, only 2 things happen, not 3. If the bird is a chatas, then blood goes on the altar and it's eaten by the Kohanim, but none of the body of the bird is burnt on the altar. If it's an olah, a burnt offering, then blood goes on the altar and it's wholly burnt on the altar and the Kohanim eat nothing. What's essential is that all 3 should happen. So with birds, you've got to bring 2. And you have to bring 2 of the different types. So that with the chatas, you have blood on the altar and it's eaten by the Kohanim. And with the olah, you have blood on the altar and it's burned up on the altar. And that way you have all 3. That's why you have 2 birds. That's a rashba. This is not playing around. This is not something that the Rosh Hashanah will think up. This is a rashba. This is one of the most fundamental sources in the whole history of Judaism. Now, what this tells you is the process of kapara, of cleansing, is not just the blood on the altar. The process of cleansing includes burning part of the body on the altar, and includes the Kohanim eating. There's actually an explicit verse, and all 3 are required. All 3 are required. In a mincha, you have it, because in a mincha, a little part is taken off and is burnt on the altar, and that's burnt on the altar right away, and the rest of it is eaten by the Kohanim. So you have equivalent to the blood and the body on the altar. So the triple performance is crucial for the kapara, for the cleansing, and that's why you need 2 birds.
But doesn't that leave a situation where you spray blood on the altar twice?
Yes, but in other words, you need all 3 performances. The fact that one performance gets done double doesn't matter. Point is, you can't leave out one of the performances. That's the crucial thing. Okay, but this is a good example. You could think of that question. You're reading through it. It could occur to you. Would you ever think of looking at Chuvas Rashba? I wouldn't. One of my friends looked it up. He told it to me. I didn't think of it. But if you have another experiences like that, you realize a lot of very smart, thoughtful people worked on this tradition. And there's a lot of explanation there. And you just have to read and dive into Kodesh Baruch Hu that he gives you the right direction to find the things you need. Okay.